I want to preface my comments by saying that when I first proposed this, I was thinking about talking about a tool that I use to think about all the aspects of supervision. And in terms of teaching lessons with content in mind. But after yesterday and today, I'm totally rethinking what this tool could be used for, because now I'm thinking about more intentional conversations about equity and social justice and racism and anti-racism and abolitionist teaching based on everything that we've been hearing in the last few days. So the template for this slide is in Google Slides and is called Shift. And that really represents how my thinking is changing in terms of my role as a supervisor. So, so Bandura talked about students, actually talked about people engaging in activities and the fact that they would want to participate is influenced by whether they think they can do it or not. And so he proposed 4 sources of self-efficacy that are essential for someone to feel self-efficacious, that they can do something, they can do a task, they can be successful. And they're in order of the most powerful to the least powerful: mastery experiences, having personal opportunities to succeed, and then thinking about that success, what made that experience successful, watching others successfully enact a task, in this case, a lesson, social persuasion, getting positive feedback from others, and then the person's emotional and physiological state. So in thinking about these, I generated a graphic organizer for myself to think about evidence of our program and how it provides each of these experiences for our student teachers, and then what could we do next year in order to help our student teachers be more successful with this, because we want them to be resilient and we want them to be persistent. And so our team at UCI CalTeach used this as a framework for our reflections of our supervision. And so what I wanted to present was what we thought occurred, and then what supervisors could do in order to promote each of these 4 sources of self-efficacy for our student teachers. So at the top of this, in mastery experiences, are the comments made by the other supervisors in our program. And I was thinking, well, what could supervisors do in order to help students with their mastery experiences as they self-reflect on their performance, and asking them what worked and what needs improvement, and helping them to design an action plan for changes. We saw Darlene Lee enact this yesterday in her comments. And then some questions that supervisors could ask: can you tell me more about what you were thinking, or what would happen if? And then the supervisors using digital tools to support learning and assessment would support mastery experiences. But I'm thinking maybe our questions could change in helping our students to self-reflect on how they're enacting an equity and social justice framework. In Vicarious Experiences, you see what our team said happened during the school year. And because they weren't getting vicarious experiences by watching their supervisors, in some cases, our students were told, okay, go forth and teach, and the mentor teacher never appeared, never watched their lessons, didn't debrief with them about their lessons, and so they weren't even able to watch the master teacher in a successful experience. And so we need to provide our students with videos of successful teachers. And I'm thinking now that we could provide them with videos of what racial justice or racial literacy look like. Social persuasion begins with trust. So we need to have a trustful relationship with our student teachers. And I have here one of my experiences during the Zoom synchronous instruction. The student teacher had students in the classroom or on their devices post the responses to a prompt in the chat. And then I was watching those responses, and the teacher was thanking the students for those responses, not valuing them, not saying, oh, that's right, or a good idea, but just saying, thank you. But some of the responses needed to be addressed. And so I gave the student teacher a private chat message. Hey, notice what so-and-so said. And so, because they might have proposed a good idea, and the teacher wasn't acknowledging this quiet student who didn't usually participate in any conversations, was actually proposing something, and so to value that student's idea, I made a suggestion in the private chat, and so the teacher actually enacted that in the lesson. And so we were in a co-teaching model, and the student was trusting that my comments were supportive and helpful. So we can provide feedback on their weekly planners. We just saw Laura Palin's presentation about how we could provide feedback on UDL aspects of lessons and weekly planners. We want to use facilitative coaching, having the student teachers self-reflect on how they could do something differently, but not telling them, but asking probing questions to get them to think about these for themselves, and making sure that our comments were not evaluative, but are based on evidence and based on our relationship with them, that we want them to be the best teacher that they can be. And something that's subtle is when the student teachers are talking in debriefs in Zoom, we tend to look at their eyes, but actually we should be looking at the camera in order to get eye contact with them. And so that's something that we have to train ourselves to do. In order to maintain eye contact, we have to look at the camera and not the image on the screen.
Okay, Terry, I'm sorry, your time is up. So I'm going to invite everyone to take a look at the other two strategies by looking at her slides. I appreciate that. All right, thank you, Terry, so much. Thanks, Steve.
Howdy, everybody. I obviously didn't get the memo on what a professional looking slide presentation looks like. This is like something that I might have done, a few years ago, but nonetheless, the topic that first I thought I was gonna have to introduce myself, but I appreciate Celeste's lovely introduction. I'm very happy to be in the company of so many excellent professionals and doctors. But I did want to mention that in my 39 years of teaching in the classroom, I taught in Texas, I taught in Anaheim, and for the past 25 years, I taught at Irvine High School. And as Celeste said, for the past 3 years, I have been a supervisor at both UCI and Cal State Fullerton. And last semester, I had 17 student teachers. And all of them were in as great a shock as I'm sure all of you were when in the middle of March, schools closed and education changed in a way that we were completely unfamiliar with. So how they struggled with that is part of the story here. I had at least 2 of my student teachers be dropped by their master teachers. I had several others who were marginalized and really kind of pushed out of the way as the master teachers took over the online teaching. But about half of them were able to experiment with different ways of trying to make online teaching effective. And it's really important to sort of come to that notion of what most teachers did, what teaching was like in the last few months, because I think most teachers were in survival mode. They put everything they had up online. Students on their own had to access videos, PowerPoints, and typically they used the same handouts, the same assignments, and the same tests that they'd always been using. The consequence of this was a real a problem for the kind of things that we typically expect in education, what specifically we're expecting from our students. One element of communication, that between teacher and student, sort of disappeared. And so what happened as a result was you had some students who only saw teachers either on Zoom or on office hours. But maybe of more significance to us is the fact that the student-to-student connection was broken. And as a consequence of that, that really brings me to the topic that we have today. And that is what was missing online for me was collaboration. And so it may be a useful thing to sort of remind ourselves. Next slide, please. All right, so a reminder to ourselves and to our student teachers that content's important, but collaboration is equally important. And in fact, as we've seen, it is essential to the topic that we've been taking a look at, that Terry was making reference to over the past 2 days, and that's the notions of equity and justice. Just to remind you, collaboration increases communication, understanding, and equality among all students. Everyone has a chance to be heard from and listened to. Diverse learners are able to share the variety of their experiences with one another and their differing points of view. Collaboration creates scaffolding and modeling that's important for our second language learners, but really all learners, and creates greater access to the content for everyone. Finally, collaboration promotes critical thinking. Students can bounce ideas off each other. It creates a sense of teamwork, which breaks down that isolation that we had over the past 3 months. And all of this occurs in a lower risk environment. It's hard not to emphasize how important that is. A lot of students really struggle with classroom participation, much less online participation. Next slide, please. Next slide, thank you. Real quick here, without the classroom, we've lost our collaborative environment, and we've left our students essentially and literally to their own devices. That's a terrible pun. This is an awful thing. This isolation does not engage, and it does not promote learning for all. So if collaboration is an essential element of modern teaching, then we must find a way to regularly make it a part of the distance learning world. Next slide, please. So the question, how can our student teachers promote collaboration regularly in the online environment? So I think the thing, if we're taking into consideration what Terry's talking about, establishing a better relationship with our student teachers, a more open one, then the first thing we need to do is to talk to them. Next slide, please. So encourage our student teachers, rather than to tell them what to do, encourage them to think about how they could create norms of collaboration that would fit with their subject and level. Now, I don't know anything about how you would do that in math or science or English. I'm a social studies teacher, but that conversation and that question to your student teachers seems to be essential before they embark on what they're going to be doing this next semester or perhaps longer. They also should consider the difference between a synchronous live classroom setting, what that would look like there, and what it would look like in an asynchronized offline setting. Next slide, please. So my wife said, you can't pose questions like that to folks without at least coming up with some possible answers. But let me make it clear, I have no certain answers here. In fact, Matt, who's going to give our next presentation, has some amazing ideas of what's worked in his classes. But here's a few things that came out of the discussion and experiments with my student teachers last semester. In the synchronous setting, typically Zoom or Google, we've all tried, if you've done it, you've tried to have a classroom conversation, but that's very difficult to do. You need clear rules and norms and expectations in order to prevent chaos. As we saw in many of our presentations yesterday, a useful element is the discussion chat streams, which everybody can participate on, and which the moderator or teacher can then share with the students. Those also can be saved and recorded. That's a great technique. And as we used yesterday, the breakout rooms. Many of my teachers who used Zoom did breakout rooms, but they found it difficult to sort of keep kids on task. It takes great planning. And when you hop around from one classroom to the next, the kids in the other classroom maybe get off task. So we felt having a leader of some sort who could save the group discussion threads, who could put answers on a shared document, or who could be designated reporters after taking notes, could come back to the group and share the group activities. In the asynchronous setting, a lot of teachers haven't done much of this, but in that setting, what we need to do is get our kids in groups. Get them in groups to break down that isolation. But one of the key things we figured out was that if you allow the group meetings to be done by the students, then, and it's not your responsibility to determine when and where those occur, they're actually pretty good at. They can use their smartphones, FaceTime, group conference calls, Zooms, Google Docs, discussion streams, and other forms of online communication. They're actually quite good at running their own meetings. You just have to insist they do it. Next slide, please.
Matt, if you could quickly wrap that up, your time is up.
Okay, two quick types. You have formal, where you organize it, or there's ongoing groups that you have, you've set up they can use. A second type is informal collaboration. This is very few teachers do it, but everybody needs a group of people they can work together with. So study groups or study partners would be an important tool. We found that if you make it optional, they won't do it. Finally, accountability. To make sure collaboration happens with the assignment, you must explicitly describe group work and roles, require evidence of individual participation, and that individual participation should be a part of the grade. There's a few kind of examples. So hopefully you're asking the same questions that I started out with, and consider what you could do about online collaboration in the online environment. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Matt. I'm sorry. Thank you, Steve. And Matt is up next. Thanks.
I am just here to share some of the things that I did last quarter at UC Davis as far as supervision and student teaching is concerned, some of the things I learned and what that means moving forward. I confess that I don't have all the answers. In fact, I'd argue that I don't think anyone does. This is a space and an experience that we're all is new for all of us. No one has past experiences, I think, really to draw on, nor is there a playbook that someone has written up for moments of online distance learning and pandemics. So I hope that there is some time to hear from all of you and some of the insights and things you've learned throughout this process. Next slide, please. One of the things that I do think is really neat about this time is it allows us to be vulnerable, and so it helps our students realize that vulnerability is an okay thing, and you don't have to have everything figured out, and there's not a moment when student teachers are learning and they finally have everything figured out and they're good to go as a teacher, and it's constantly in this mode of learning and adjusting and revising. So here's one of the things we started with in the spring of last quarter, or of last year, thinking about trying to continue to student teach and supervise online and distance learning with me just showing up in some of the Zoom meetings. That ran into problems because not every district was comfortable letting outsiders join in on Zooms. People were still sort of learning and figuring things out at the time. Thought about video recording the Zoom session so that I could watch what the teaching looked like. Other districts were not comfortable with putting things into the cloud without consent from students. And so what we did is we settled on this model where we would meet weekly as a math cohort. So there was 11 secondary math credential students. And during our meeting times, 3 of those 11 students would teach a 30-minute lesson. or they would have 30 minutes to teach as much of a lesson as possible, I should say. They would write lesson plans for whatever they would normally be teaching in their placement class, and however long that was. If it was a block, they'd write a lesson plan for a block. If it was a traditional, they'd write a lesson plan for a traditional. And they do as much as possible to get through that lesson, and it was okay if they got cut short due to time constraints. Although things did move along a little bit faster because the audience, their students were, we'll say, a little bit more sophisticated, mathematically speaking, than perhaps the audience they normally would work with. Cohort members just took on the role of students. They were advised not to make poor choices. This was not an exercise in classroom management. So that was sort of a clear expectation moving forward. One of the things that we did is we would take opportunities during a lesson plan if things were, well, if there were moments where we wanted to revise or redo something, we would take that opportunity. So we'd pause the lesson, we'd rewind it, and then we'd go through the exact same thing again with maybe some revisions, which might be particularly useful in light of some of the things that we might be learning, talking about, thinking about from this conference we have together around issues of equity, of race, of justice, to incorporate those into some of those things. It might be a worthwhile opportunity. And then over the course of our spring quarter, every member of the cohort was able to teach 3 of these online 30-minute lessons. After each lesson, students or student teachers who took on the role of students would then put their teacher hats on and give feedback in the form of 2 stars and a wish. In other words, 2 positive comments and something they wish was part of the lesson but wasn't for whatever reason. And that was given in an online discussion thread. My feedback took on the same as it always did. I would take notes as a supervisor as I would have done if I was in person in a classroom. And then we'd have our typical debriefs sometime after the online session. We'd meet, we talk by phone, we talk by Zoom and so forth. Although I will comment that I made it a point to also make comments on the discussion thread because I think it's really important as teachers that we don't just offload that and pretend like it doesn't exist. It's really important for our students to know that we are reading these things. And so I made it a point to do some commenting on the discussion thread as well. Next slide, please. So here's some of the things that I learned for what it's worth. One is that student teachers generally enjoyed doing this work. At least that's what they said on the anonymous course evaluations at the end. And they really gained a lot from their peer feedback and also gained a lot from observing some of their peers teach and sometimes even some of the same topics that they were teaching. Another thing, you might already realize this yourselves, Zoom fatigue is very real, but technology was not much of a hurdle for the students that I work with, which is to say that they're very easy figuring out breakout rooms, how to manage Padlet, how to manage Poll Everywhere, all the various sorts of tools that were online. They really took those things up and ran with them without that really being too much of an issue at all. One of the things that I noticed, particularly with all 11 of the students that I work with, is that some of the strengths and their limitations were really amplified once we got onto online and distance learning. So if student teachers were really good at facilitating class discussions, that really came through in Zoom. If they weren't really good at facilitating student discourse, that also was very true in online. In fact, it's even more exaggerated with online distance learning. And so if student teachers were, creating norms, I think collaboration, Steve was talking about last time, if they were good having collaborative work happening in person, that was also very true in Zoom. Not so much if that was a struggle of theirs when they were doing it in person, it very much was even more so an issue when they were on Zoom. We were not really able to practice sort of general pedagogical things that cut across all content areas, classroom management, time management, those sorts of things. Were not really able to practice in these Zoom environments, but it did really create an opportunity for students to practice content-specific things, such as, say, using multiple representations. I just came from a UDL supervision model where that's one of the things that's part of universal design for learning. Making connections, which is really important mathematically for conceptual understanding. Anyways, and some of these improvements I think happened in ways that I wasn't seeing prior to this online or distance learning thing, which I thought was pretty interesting. Next slide, please. So here's what we're going to be doing in the fall and summer and fall for what it's worth. And again, I don't have all the answers here. This is just something we're trying out, and you can see if you follow along There's a few different placements in our program. Traditionally, student teachers work in 2 different classrooms. One's referred to as a primary, others referred to as a secondary. And so we'll have students who are going to work in primary the entire time more as assistants and observers because the teaching is going to be done just as I mentioned earlier with our 30-minute lessons before. One of the things that this does is it allows to adhere to or still subscribe to the approximations of practice framework, which I don't have much time to talk about, but I'm happy to add on later. It also allows me, I think most importantly, coming back to supervision, to continue supervising in the same ways that I've always done. Audience might be a little different, but I continue to take notes and I have access to all the various things that I did if it was in person. I'm almost out of time here, so I will yield whatever time I have left and look forward to maybe hearing from all of you afterwards.
Great, thank you, Matt. Now we're going to hear from Heather.
I am Heather Ballinger. Unfortunately, I'm not a doctor yet, but I'm working on it. I'm in the Candell Educational Leadership Program at UC Davis right now, and I just completed my coursework, and I'm doing my research and dissertation with Dr. Margarita Jimenez Silva, and I'm working on researching the relationship between mentor teachers and university supervisors in the support of helping pre-service teachers learning to teach. So that's my area of focus. So I'm really happy to be here. I've also been a supervisor at Humboldt State for about 10 years. I put in this Sasquatch because that's kind of like our unofficial Humboldt motto. We're actually the Lumberjacks, but it's kind of one of those funny virtual backgrounds that they provided by the university. So I just put that one in there. But one of the unique things I think about our program in the School of Ed at HSU is that we do have a distance accessible credential program, which means we have one cohort in our secondary program that's all local candidates in local schools. And then we have an online program that is distance accessible. So we have students that are spread out primarily in rural areas all across California, Crescent City, you know, so I mean, I can go on and on, but Southern California to Northern California, all over. So we do have some experience with online supervision, although our student teachers are, before COVID, were doing their student teaching in local schools. So that the film component of it is something that I'll talk a little bit about, but COVID is also obviously put some Zoom focused supervision in our program as well. So one thing we use in our program, and that's the title of this, we love acronyms in education. We call it the VELR, and it's the Video Elicited Lesson Reflection. I put a copy in the PDF version of it in the shared resources for this presentation, and feel free to use it any way you want. So go ahead and go to the next slide. Thanks. So mostly these are just notes for me, and then I just did a screenshot of the first part of the VELR reflection. What we noticed is, like I said, we have an online accessible cohort, and that we have distance supervisors who complete all of their observations via online submission. And we've noticed that what we're noticing in the kind of the origin story of this video elicited lesson reflection is that the university supervisor and the resident teacher would give written and oral feedback, but there'd be some mixed results with that when it was either live or even via video, unless we required the candidates to actually watch the video. Because there'd be a lot of, oh no, that's not really what happens, that's not really a typical day. And then we also noticed that in our, we use EdTPA at our, in our program, and that our candidates were struggling with articulating themselves and capturing what was required of the video component in EdTPA. So we started with thinking about how we could improve and kind of de-escalate the amount of stress that our candidates were experiencing via the filming and video component of the EdTPA part. So on this first part, on this first screenshot here of what we ask of the candidates is that they film themselves and then they watch their own video of themselves teaching and then complete the reflection template, which is in the following slide, before they have a conference with their supervisor. And then either the supervisor and the candidate get together and they watch it together and they talk about it, or the supervisor watches it before, and then they have a meeting with, and they kind of review the talking that the candidate does, and they have evidence to support what they think that they demonstrated within their video related to TPEs. So the idea is to give them sentence stems, and you can see some of them here that we're trying to prompt them to help practicing articulating themselves in writing and pulling evidence from their video clips to highlight the strategies that they are using within the video. And then, so I think I said that is good practice for their TPA, and usually we use this Veller, although we're in conversation about using it for more often, but we usually only use it, like we were kind of trying to start small. We only have this for one of our formal observations that are in the spring, and we're starting to think about ways that we can incorporate it into our fall program, but also maybe a small component of it that they use in their observations that they do during their student teaching in the spring. Next slide. So you can see basically it's just a table chart which asks, and you can see it on the right hand side here, this is just page 2 of this reflection template, and it just asks them to identify the standards and the objectives of their lesson, and then kind of talk about, similar to what they ask for in the TPA, to talk about what's happening before the video clip and after the video clip. Some things that I noticed though, and this is not COVID related, but audio and video equipment for our candidates is often hard to find, and the quality of the video would vary. Some supervisors ask their candidates to just point the video at the students while they're learning in the classroom. A lot of them try to use their cell phones to do audio recording and video and audio recording, and it was really bad, poor quality. And I think that was a good learning experience for them, because then they knew that they couldn't do that for their TPA. So it kind of avoided some of these problems. And then kind of like Matt said, audio and video can be shared easily on Zoom, but there's privacy concerns with districts and other mentor teachers and parents and students that I don't think we've worked out yet, that we're still working about, and that's something that kind of needs to be discussed amongst programs. And then I agree with Matt that these teaching strengths and challenges are really amplified with online teaching, and there's many reasons why resident teachers and pre-service teachers are struggling now. And then I put an article in here about e-supervision and how it helps student self-advocacy with pre-service teachers. I'm not associated with any of these researchers at San Diego State, but I found their e-supervision really interesting if you're interested in doing any further reading. And that's all I have to say about that.
Great. Well, thank you, Heather. Thank you to all the presenters. I would like to give all of the presenters, Terry, Steve, Heather, and Matt, just a moment. If you have any final comments you'd like to make before we open it up for participant input. So participants, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom right of your screen. If you have a contribution here, we want to hear not only your questions, but if you have insights to share as well. But first, we're going to, let's see if Matt, Terry, Steve, or Heather has any final comments. And then I will be calling on folks with the raised hands.
If there are no questions, I would love to just hear what other people did, learned, tried, and how that might inform what they're going to be up to as far as supervision is concerned this coming school year.
Great, and let's start by hearing from Chris.
Oh, I had a question for Matt about the work that you did. Was the getting together with the students and doing the micro teaches, was that part of a methods class, or was it just something you did as a supervisor? Or
Yeah, it was just something we did as part of supervision. So I reached out to all of the mentor, resident, cooperating teachers in advance and said, hey, I got to supervise and this isn't working. So can I steal one day or one morning anyways away from your student teacher to have us meet? And so we met Monday mornings. I think we started at 9 and went to about noon. Give or take. We had breaks in between each of the lessons or the presentations, and yeah, during that time, we all got together via Zoom, and that's when the lessons happened. So it was not part of a course, not methods, and later on in that day, we also had our student teaching seminar, and I tried to find ways to bring the two together in ways that would ask for them to reflect, to learn, and talk about some of their the feedback and things that they want to continue to work on as part of seminar. But yeah, it definitely was something separate that we arranged to do.
Yeah, and in the fall, are you planning on doing this again? I mean, I know fall is kind of more observation type supervision, but are you planning on anything different for the fall, or?
Yeah, so I mentioned the approximations of practice earlier. And I mean, the gist of that is simply that student teachers continually take on more and more authentic experiences in teaching. And so one of the things, I mean, in our model anyway, student teachers begin the year with observing and then assisting, and then eventually they will take over. And so since some of the observations they're going to be doing early on are sort of Zoom and not sort of, they are Zoom and not maybe in a face-to-face classroom, we're going to start by watching a lot of classroom videos. Our director got us access to Atlas. I don't remember what that acronym stands for, but it's essentially a library of videos from people who have submitted portfolios for the National Board Certification. And so we'll start by watching some of those videos together and really focusing in on the lens for some of the things that they're learning in their methods classes and how they're observing those things. From there, we'll move to what I just mentioned we did in the spring. So after the video watching, the next step is they're going to teach with their peers. And my hope is that maybe before the end of this calendar year, not the academic year, they'll be ready to take on at least teaching in Zoom in whatever their environments are in a way that doesn't take away from their credibility or worse, have a negative impact on their students' learning. And by students, I mean at this point, middle and high school students.
Great, thank you both, Matt and Chris. So we're going to hear from Jennifer now.
Yeah, I just had a question about the format of it. I guess I was thinking more about the organization. So it sounds like did you do like 3 presentations a week, or just kind of thinking about how you organized it and how many they were responsible for doing and everything?
Yeah, so we Mondays from 9 to 12, and so the first person would teach, and we'd have about a 15-minute break, and during that 15 minutes, everyone was expected to give feedback. We have Canvas as our management system, so we had a discussion thread on there, and they'd leave their feedback there. Whatever time they had remaining, we'd take a break, and we do it all over again. So from week to week, I would tell people when they were going to be teaching, and I gave them about a week in advance notice. So after my practice, usually I got in the habit of at the end of the day of everyone teaching and debriefing with everyone, then I would send out the email, hey, so-and-so, you're teaching next. I did my best not to have anyone teach back to back, but it was just my best effort. I'm sure somebody actually ended up doing that, or maybe multiple people.
All right, we have to conclude. Please, participants, join me in thanking Matt and Terry and Steve and Heather for sharing their great experiences and resources. Thank you so much. And we want to thank you for joining us today. Again, thanks, Matt, Terry, Steve, and Heather. Great presentations, very informative. Thank you.